So to add a little sunshine to your afternoon, I'm going to talk to you about disasters. So I think the last time I was here, it was probably maybe last spring. I hadn't been on the job very long, but what a year it was. We're constantly stay busy at GOHSEP. In 2016, as all of you know, historic flooding impacted more than half the state. 56 out of the 64 parishes were under a federal disaster declaration. But that was only part of the story. 85% of our population were affected by these floods. The Baton Rouge region, as you know, which is typically the hub of support during an emergency, suffered some of the worst damage, making a difficult situation more challenging. About 30% of GOHSEP employees had their homes flood, and yet they came in and continued to work. Between the massive floods, we also obviously had the tragic Baton Rouge police shootings and protests, which required a tremendous level of emergency activity. And that was just 2016. Now, also, with everything that was going on, we also had, at the time, 16 open disasters going all the way back to Katrina, about over 30,000 project worksheets that we manage, over 5,000 applicants that we deal with on a daily basis, and that was about a total about $17 billion that we manage. I'm happy to say that we're now down to 14 open disasters with about $15 billion that we manage, but the applicants are about the same because of last year's flood. So 2017, we consider a year of near misses in many ways. We've had 14 severe weather events thus far in 2017 and 5 tropical events. That's not to make light of Harvey. Harvey impacted about 300 homes in Calcasieu and Cameron Parish, and we're still discussing that issue with FEMA as we speak. We obviously with Hurricane Nate was coming right for us, and then at the last moment veered off and hit our neighbors in Mississippi. We also, as a result of the August floods last year, we implemented our shelter at home program, where we went in and cleaned up over 11,000 homes, gutted them, cleaned them out, sanitized them, and made them safe and habitable. We didn't do permanent reconstruction work because we were not allowed to under FEMA rules and regulations, but that was 11,000 homes that we were able to get in and make safe and habitable. So potentially folks could go back home. That program, by the way, now has been improved, and it is in use in Texas, Florida, and Puerto Rico. So they used the program that we developed here in Louisiana. They took our suggestions and recommendations to make it better, and adding some things that we asked for but didn't get, and now they're the beneficiaries of that program. The other thing I will tell you is we deployed a number of our folks through the Emergency Management Assistance Compact to Texas, Florida, Georgia, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico to assist them with disaster recovery and response. Now, having said all that, said, okay, so what? So what we did, and as we do every time after a disaster, is we conduct after action reviews to see what we did well, what we didn't do so well, and to capture recommendations going forward. Danielle Amon, who's here in the audience today, my executive counsel, and Casey Tingle and myself were one of 12 states that were invited to Washington, D.C. last month to sit down with the National Emergency Management Association and discuss ways to improve disaster response. So out of that came some recommendations, some of which you may find coming out of the Transportation Infrastructure Committee in Washington, D.C. from Congress. I think Congressman Graves is a co-sponsor of that bill. It's H.R. 4460. So if you care to take a look at that. But what we did here in the state is we looked at those things that we could do better, and we sat down and we said, okay, how can we take what we learned and go to our legislature and recommend some changes to our current law. So that's what we did. So I'm just going to read you the purpose of this thing. And we initially called it the 2016 Flooding Improvement Act of 2018. But it's going to be a number of recommendations that are going to be broken out into several bills if we get the traction there. And we've been speaking with the governor's office on this. But in 2016, March and August flooding events affected 56 of the 64 parishes, as I mentioned earlier. In August alone, more than 193,000 homes and businesses were damaged from a no-name storm that dropped 7 trillion gallons of water over South Louisiana in 3 days. Now, up until Maria, Harvey, and Irma, this storm was the third largest in terms of monetary damage, only behind Katrina and Sandy. So I think probably now Maria's probably overtaken those, but we'll see here shortly. Even more difficult, since the beginning of 16, numerous other smaller disasters have occurred that received little or no federal assistance. You may remember the tornadoes that occurred in the river parishes did not reach the federal threshold for a federal disaster declaration. So the state and the local governments wound up having to foot the bill for that. So as federal dollars continue to decline, and you're seeing that come from D.C. these days, states have to be more capable to quickly respond and recover to emergencies and disasters. The best way to deal with this is by strengthening our public-private partnerships and our volunteer emergency manager relationships. So that's what we took a look at, and that's some of the recommendations that we have. But this particular act intends to rectify statutes we have identified that have slowed response and recovery efforts over the last 2 years. The first one we took a look at was having to do with the National Guard. The National Guard in Louisiana, for a state this size, has probably got one of the largest populations per capita for National Guardsmen. I think there's over 11,000 Air and Army National Guardsmen. We rely heavily on the Louisiana Guard for response in everything we do, as do other states. So one of the things we found was what we needed to do was provide injury support to Louisiana National Guard when called to state active duty. There's 2 ways to call the Guard up by the governor. He can either call them up under state active duty where the state pays the bill, or we can request of National Guard Bureau to Department of Defense to put them in a Title 32 status where they get federal dollars to pay that. That's only been done a very few times in the past. DOD is not likely to do that, so oftentimes, unless we get a disaster that meets the federal threshold, those guardsmen and women are in a state active duty status. Now, what does that mean? They don't get the same protection as far as injuries that they would if they were under a Title 32 status covered by the federal government. So we're looking to replicate what is now in law for Civil Air Patrol folks to take care of those National Guardsmen. And then the other piece is a change to the ethics code to add guardsmen and women under state active duty to relieve soldiers of concerns or accidental violations when they're being called to state active duty. The other thing we took a look at was there are certain things that the governor seems to enact, at least in our experience in the last almost 2 years, as far as executive powers. So we looked at the things that are always recurring and say, why do we have to do this every time? Why can't he just have the power to do this? So we're exploring that idea right now along with the governor's staff. And those 2 things are suspending liberative and preemptive prescription, and the other one is extending the time to file an insurance claim. And those are just things that we habitually have had to take a look at and go to the governor and explore. Now, bearing in mind each disaster is different, so we'll continue to take a look at that. The other thing we saw was, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is strengthening public-private sector relationship. Currently, there's a kind of it's very difficult for GOHSEP to accept donations. So what we have to do is we have to go to an organization, for instance, like Pennington or BRAF or another organization like that to get those. So we're looking to try to do a little bit, something to make it a little bit easier where we can accept donations and get them to the right people a lot quicker. For instance, Walmart, Carmen, they wanted to write a check. We can't accept that at GOHSEP, but we can try to steer them in the right direction. The other thing is strengthening volunteer emergency manager relationships. We're looking at a credentialing. Everybody hears about the Cajun Navy. There's actually 5 factions of the Cajun Navy. We've actually met with one. What we're looking at is getting them training so that they can be credentialed so that we can have one of their folks liaison with us when they're sent out to do these things, so we know where they're going, so we can pair them up with our first responders on search and rescue, and we don't duplicate efforts. The other thing we're looking at trying to do there is maybe assist them in some way with providing them with commodities such as fuel and things of that nature. So that's something, sharing of equipment, immunity for those volunteers, much like state first responders getting out. So that's another thing we're exploring. And then the ability for private nonprofits to make a claim for damaged equipment or materials, fuel, food, etc. We had the Celtic Center during the August flood, one of their movie sound stages. We had tremendous outpouring of donated goods, which we cataloged and tracked, and we're now submitting as part of our cost share for shelter at home to reduce that state cost share there. And then the other thing is updating EMAC protections. There's a number of states are looking now, and under the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, is once you get those volunteers credentialed and certified and get them established as a response team, thinking about the idea of then being able to send them to assist another state under EMAC, and that's some of the things we're taking a look at. And then another thing is immunity for state and local emergency managers. Currently, if you accept, as a sub-applicant, if you accept money from FEMA, you can't sue FEMA going forward. We don't get the same protection at GOHSEP. We get sued often by contractors. So if you're accepting the money, we're a pass-through for the federal government. We think we ought to be exempt from that too. So that's something else, in a limited nature with a limited scope. So that's something else we're exploring as well. And then we're looking, once the Stafford Act dollars are end, there's a recovery support framework in place since 2012 that the federal government has, with 6 recovery support functions. And it's housing, it's infrastructure, it's those things. But basically what it does is it allows a community to come together with 20 federal agency partners and 6 state agency partners and look at how do we make our community stronger and better going forward. And so what we think ought to be done is we think a subcommittee under the Unified Command Group. There are currently 4 subcommittees. We think another should be added for long-term recovery, just to keep that emphasis going. Right now, we're doing work under the August flood and the March flood with 6 different parishes and/or municipalities on long-term recovery. And then the other thing we dealt a lot with that's very problematic is reinterment of graves or of caskets that are unearthed after a flood or a hurricane. Currently, when a casket is or a tomb it pops up as a result of a flood or a hurricane, if it's not identified and it's not from a public cemetery, FEMA doesn't pay for it under public assistance. Under individual assistance, oftentimes what we have to do is we have to go out and find a concerned citizen to go in, file an affidavit with a local district court judge, and then they receive the individual assistance money to ensure that that casket is placed back where it should be. After we did a lot of work with the forensic lab at LSU and the Attorney General's office to identify these and then to get them reinterred. So we think first of all, the creation of a response task force, a reinterment response task force, and then addition to 2 Title VIII reinterment statutes that allow the task force to move and reinter bodies in response to disasters, because right now it's a very complicated process. And then there are a number of other issues that we looked at that we found were already covered in law, and that's health permits for accepting volunteer food in shelters, fire marshal laws when you exceed capacity. We ran into that difficulty in Burton Coliseum with Harvey. I don't know if you know, but we actually sheltered around 5,000 Texans. We rescued them from Port Arthur, Orange, Beaumont area. We brought them back to the Lake Charles Civic Center and Burton Coliseum, and then we put them up at 2 different mega shelters in the state. We housed a number of them, almost 3,000, at the Alexandria mega shelter there at LSUA, and then we sent some up to Shreveport to Joella Street. So we found those 2 particular laws are already covered in Title 29. And then donations for state employees and fundraising within state agencies for state employee disaster survivors. That was actually enacted last year under Title 42, so we're covered there. Our current initiative right now too is we're putting together a volunteer training plan to go out and train volunteers. We have a toolkit we put together, and the purpose of this is that when you have volunteers doing work, to capture those hours and capture those donated goods so that the state then gets credit for that, or the parish or municipality, so that it can be used as a cost share offset in the state's cost share or the parish's cost share piece in a disaster. So we feel pretty good about that. We've actually done a pilot training program in Terrebonne Parish, and we look forward to having that come out. So with that pretty much wraps up what we're doing. We're still involved, obviously, with the 14 open disasters that we have in trying to conclude those. But I'll be happy to entertain any questions if anyone has any. Yes, sir.
How many cases are still open on the reinternment process? I know there were quite a few in East Baton Rouge, Livingston, and St. Helena.
Question is how many internment cases are still open? I'm assuming you're talking about the August flood, because we still have some in Calcasieu for Harvey. I think we pretty much got all those done. So I can get that specific for you, but I feel pretty confident we've got a number of those done. And we've actually, there's a lot of discussion about grid mapping now for some of those private cemeteries, so we know who is in what grave. I can tell you, I now live in Abbeville. A lot of those Catholic cemeteries, they know exactly who's buried where, and it's plotted with plots. They have actual plats that show where they're at. So I think everybody else we're trying to get to that piece now where it's not so difficult, where we don't have to get LSU Forensics Lab to open up the casket, which is quite a process. Yes, sir.
What kind of training will you be offering Cajun Navy volunteers?
Well, what we're looking at is, first of all, we're going to meet with them and have them come in, and we already have talked to one faction and see what they need. But one thing for a maritime search and rescue, Coast Guard boating safety, for instance, wildlife and fisheries boating safety courses, things of that nature. They have also exhibited an interest in CPR classes, which we can facilitate. We have a training section that has access to FEMA courses online and their training. So that's some of the things we'll be taking a look at. Yes, sir.
Next question. Does GOHSEP and FEMA projects rely upon the integrity of the applicants and GOHSEP's contractors, your administrators? And if so, is there a mechanism in place to check for collusion by those parties to defraud either or both agencies, you and FEMA?
Yeah, I would tell you that, first of all, yes, we do. It is, The Louisiana Legislative Auditor is embedded. I have 29 legislative auditors in my recovery section. And along with those folks that are out there writing the project worksheets, they're responsible too for that. And then we have state applicant liaisons, which liaise with the applicants there. So we have those things in place. I could tell you with Shelter at Home, for instance, there was a 4-level process that we went through to make sure those are dealt with. And we're disallowing some of that now, some of that cost, because it wasn't done the way it should have been done correctly.
You mentioned legislative auditors. I have met with them in the past, and they explained to me that a lot of this program is based upon good faith. And if GOHSEP's contractors that y'all contract as administrators, and if applicants, monitors, and all, a lot of times when they get the information in their office, is based upon individuals that are hired by y'all that sign off. There's no way of checking what really happened, like just to say on the debris cleanup project. There's no way to really check what happened out in the field. It's just based on individuals signing off on these projects. Yes, this is where the work was done.
Right.
It was eligible work. But if these individuals, these administrators and monitors and applicants, if they're getting together and colluding on the...
Please get to a question. We don't need a...
That's my question. So the point is y'all, it's a lot of it's based upon good faith. So if to catch if there's some colluding going on, it's impossible to collect, if they're just looking at documents people's just signing off on, if there's colluding going on, how do what do y'all have besides, that's the mechanism, just the legislative law?
Yes, well, that and the person that's out in the field taking a look at it, and our inspectors. But if there's certainly ever evidence of that could be proven, we'll be glad to take a look at it. I can tell you there are other avenues that exist out there for particular applicants or contractors that may have had that happen in the past, and that's the Inspector General's office here in the state and the Attorney General's office.
So if there's evidence that that's happening, do you recommend that those PWs should be maybe rewritten if there's evidence that there was some colluding?
First of all, I'd say that'd be up to, if that project worksheet's already completed, I would say that then that needs to be brought to the local law enforcement agencies to do an investigation. Yes, sir.
Could you talk a little bit more about the genesis of wanting to get the Cajun Navy credential, I think was the term you used?
Yeah.
As well as kind of what that process is going to look like from the Cajun Navy's perspective, trying to get through whatever process there is.
Yeah, we're still in the process of developing that. So one of the factions I mentioned, we've already talked to, had preliminary discussions with. So we're in the very infant stages of coming up with this thing. So once we get them in there, we'll discuss with them what it is they want to see. But I know, for instance, one of these factions, the particular leader of this thing does a background check on them. So that's things we'd be interested in. The other thing is to see what classes they already have, and then see what they need going forward. I know a number of parishes now with their shelter volunteers, they have them go through the Red Cross class to get certified on shelters so that they're properly trained, and then they actually issue an armband that shows they are a certified volunteer, and then they keep track of it. What would be beneficial for us is we know who these people are, we know where they're being dispatched to rescue people, so that if we can provide commodities to them and give them any type of relief from any damages they may incur. That's what we're looking at it, because they're not going away. So we figure we should at least partner with them. And let's face it, we can never be, as a government, we can never be as fast as you as neighbors and friends and citizens. So we need that. We saw that in Harvey. We saw that in the August flood. So that's kind of our thinking, is rather than just have them out there, we want to partner with them and have them assist us.
Is that legislation you're going to have to work through in the next legislative session?
That's what we're preparing for, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that you could not take a donation from Walmart. Was that because of the ethics laws of the state, or is it because of some peculiarity
It's the ethics laws, yes, sir. Question was the donations, why can't we take them? Plus, as a agency director, without having that put it in some type of legislation, I don't want to take the chance of doing that. But we may be doing business with them at some point, you know, under a contract with a particular vendor, so I don't want to do that. Yeah. Yes, sir.
The legislation y'all carried last year, are y'all plan on presenting that again?
We can't. The question was the legislation we tried to carry forward last year, which was a insurance fee bill, which was basically would have given us, we think, about $5 to $7 million, and we were going to pass through the majority of that to the parishes, emergency management offices. We can't this year because it's not a fee or tax bill year, so we would have to wait till next year to do it. We're still looking at that. A number of states do it. Florida does it. The state fire marshal gets some revenue from an insurance fee bill. So we still got it in mind. Because let me say that our funding in GOHSEP, you know, the state general fund dollars I get, the majority of it, almost 98% of it, go to pay FEMA cost share debt. The remainder of that goes to pay other agencies for back office support. For instance, Human Resources is run by the Department of Public Safety. We don't have our own HR department. We pay Civil Air Patrol's operating cost. We have to provide a small cost share for our federal salaries. My salary and all of GOHSEP employees are paid by federal grant dollars. So this was another way to give us a little bit of funding to better prepare in the future. And unfortunately, it was withdrawn in committee and didn't get past the committee hearing. So we may try it again next legislative session. Yes, sir.
In the aftermath of Hurricane Gustave, the $58 million in fraud-related invoices that Corey Delahousse identified that ultimately resulted in FEMA having an arbitration hearing and denying it. Do you think that left a lasting impression with FEMA about Louisiana's reputation? And if so, do you think that was just strictly an indictment on the prior administration of oversight, or is that now, do you have confidence that sort of episode wouldn't repeat itself?
I do. And I can tell you that I've met with the FEMA administrator numerous times, the new administrator, and I think that he's seen what we have in place now. And we had a discussion on another potential issue of not dealing with fraud, because I've told them, and I've told the DHS OIG office, if there's evidence of fraud, let's go after them. I'm a former prosecutor. Let's go after those people. And so, you know, I think now, new administration, you know, on both levels, I think we've got a clean slate going forward. The problem is there's 14 open disasters going all the way back to Katrina. So we're now having to deal with things that happened 12 years ago, which is problematic. That, you know, response doesn't keep me awake at night. That stuff does. So I'm very cognizant of that, and I'm very aware of that. And we try to learn lessons from all of that, and going forward, we try to implement those lessons. So I think, you know, as far as myself and Administrator Long goes, we've got a clean slate. Yeah. And by the way, you know, in those instances, we're going after those folks for fraud where we can, where the local district attorneys will take it. So this lady right here. Yes, ma'am.
You said you were talking about not being able to take a donation from Walmart. How then were you able, or was the state able to use the testing center? Because that's a private, it was a private enterprise. He donated as a shelter.
Yeah, I think we did that under executive powers. I think is how we did it, just to cover that piece. And what we did with Walmart, we contacted BRAF, I think, and then they took the donation. So, yes, sir.
I know you had the former, but it's my understanding, Chief of Staff, Mr. William Rochelle, which was a really nice guy. It's my understanding that he's no longer there. Do you have you appointed a new Chief
Yes.
of Staff?
Yes, sir. Question was, my former Deputy Chief of Staff, Will Rochelle, left to go to private sector. Casey Tingle, who was my Assistant Deputy for Hazard Mitigation, he is now the Deputy and my Chief of Staff. So.